Hello, I'm Michael Mountain, and I've been helping with the work of the Non-Human Rights Project. In December 2013, we filed suit on behalf of 4 chimpanzees being held in inhumane conditions in New York State. And we argued that these cognitively complex, self-aware, autonomous animals should be recognized as having the fundamental legal right to bodily liberty. This would enable them to be set free, so they could spend the rest of their lives in sanctuaries where they could live as close to the wild as is possible in North America. Author and journalist Charles Siebert has written a cover story for the New York Times Magazine about these cases. I called him on the phone to ask him about the cases, about some of his other work, and about what he's writing about next. You actually talked to one of the 3 judges in one of the 3 cases. That was Judge Size,
Yes.
Who presided over the Tommy case, and he actually talked to you on the phone. Is that unusual? How did that go? What was that about?
Well, I must tell you, for me, it was quite unusual because, one, I'd never done anything like that before. And I fully did not expect to get him. I just looked up the courthouse number where we were that day, and I called up and I got the secretary of the judge, and I started into this nervous kind of stuttery synopsis of what I was interested in and why I would like to maybe one day set up a interview. And the next thing I know, she says, "Would you like to speak to the judge?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Hold on." And boom, there was Judge Size on the telephone. Well, thankfully, I had prepared for that eventuality, as unlikely as I thought it would be, and had scribbled down 3 or 4 pertinent questions, and off we went. And he was very congenial. We sort of just bandied some things about, just in a colloquial, friendly manner first, about his days in the Bronx as a young legal assistant, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, when we got to the case itself, he was very evasive, basically prefacing everything he said with, judges are not allowed to really discuss their decisions and what's behind them and blah, 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 their thinking behind them. But, I was able to draw him out a little, and I drew him out first on the fact that when the case was decided, I let him know that Stephen and Natalie and Elizabeth were quite ecstatic, which was a little bit of an anomaly to me because I'm something of a neophyte when it comes to legalities, and I thought, oh, what a bummer, he just shot him right down, and no, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, they got what they wanted, which was a full airing of their case so that it can go to appeal. And I said to the judge, they felt they were very excited and they thought you were very indulgent of them and that you were purposefully allowing them to take this to the appellate level. And he said, absolutely, I was. I was very conscious of that. And as quoted in the piece, here's a bunch of lawyers who are living and dying this cause. And I went on to say, as he did in the courtroom, I'm very impressed with your argument. And if you were there that day, you would have known it was like it didn't begin well. I mean, Stephen was very understandably nervous and welled up because he, had only been working on this argument all his life, essentially. And now he's got his first opportunity to air it in a courtroom. And, as I said in the piece, you could almost hear the gears in his brain snagging. And, and the judge kept preempting him and was very sort of like a woodpecker, like pop, 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 kept coming at him. But, Stephen hit his stride, and the longer the trial went, the more attentive and silent Judge Size became. And, he would lean in and sort of nod his head. So on balance, when it was all over, the judge said, I was very impressed. And, I'm just not ready to extend Article 70, writ of habeas corpus, to a non-human, and I'm keeping it that. On my job. And it was just what Stephen warned. He said, at this level, a judge is not going to be the one to look stupid, to make history here, because their job is to not exceed my legal bounds or the law. So, but I loved that both he and the judge in Niagara Falls were very taken and allowed the full airing and almost were apologetic about their inability to grant Stephen what he was after. And Bonillo, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, in Niagara Falls, even went so far as to use the phrase that Stephen had not even recalled himself using in an early interview I did with him, which is getting someone to make the leap of faith, a judge to make the leap of faith, and that how his job, Stephen's job, was to make that leap seem something less than a quantum leap with the help of the science and all the evidence. And for the judge himself to almost apologetically say at the end of the hearing, "I'm sorry, but I'm not able to make that leap of faith," was so, for me, telling and provocative, because it's exactly what Stephen's asking for and what will be required and what will, he is convinced, one day be made by some judge who, to quote Stephen, doesn't feel that the road is closed off or the way is closed off. I think Stephen made very clear to me, and, he didn't expect to win in this first round and probably not for many rounds, that I think I always found it compelling that he's a little ahead of the tide here. The world's not quite ready for this yet, but they're going to be in some way, and that he's planting the seeds for this discussion and argument and advancing it. I just thought there's a story, right? He's a real crusader in that way. Someone who's got a vision and is willing to be laughed at and thought absurd and barked at in courtrooms, as he has been.
Literally barked at in courtrooms.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. People who accomplish things are willing to abide that and not be dissuaded by it. So I love that idea. I love that idea that he was this kind of half-crazed crusader of a kind, and is willing to countenance all the contumely and all that.
It is clearly all kind of heading in a direction. I mean, there's this whole kind of movement building up really at the moment, not just in courtrooms, like what Non-Human Rights Project is doing, but you've got the proposed legislation in California recently that would bring an end to orcas being in entertainment and all sorts of other initiatives. Do you have any sense about where this is all heading?
One of the really gut-wrenching, sad aspects of this is that this fight and this consciousness with science that allows this fight is coming at such a late date. And it's that way with humans that, you don't know what you had until it's gone kind of thing. I mean, so many of the very species that Stephen's fighting on behalf of and that these other folks that you mentioned are near an end game here thanks to us.
You're talking about the fact when you say they're coming to an end game that they're heading for extinction, yeah?
Exactly, that we're so encroaching on their habitat, and it's very germane that we learn that places like SeaWorld be kept from continuing this practice of co-opting these animals for people's entertainment. But then you have, when it comes to elephants in the wild, they need so much land and open migratory routes for the integrity of their genetic makeup, and the same is true of jaguars. And, the whole conservation model's changing, that you just don't put a fence around one so-called patch of paradise and believe that the animals can fare within that. It doesn't work that way. And this is what worries me about certain species like elephants. And the reality is that we're this really rapacious and voracious species on this planet, and here are all these other complex cultures that are non-human that we're forever encroaching upon. So I don't know what the solutions are, but I am glad that there are a lot of really smart and committed people on all fronts working on that, whether it's in the wild or whether it's in the courtroom.
Any next animal-related stories in the works at your end?
Yes, a compelling story that's coming out in the Smithsonian, and it's about a beluga whale who was conscripted from the wild by the U.S. Navy back in the 1970s to be a kind of Cold War spy for the Navy when the Russians began developing submarines that could secrete themselves under the polar ice cap. And the Navy had to date been using dolphins for their marine mammal program, as it's called, but dolphins can't swim in frigid waters like that, so they got belugas. And one of the 6 that they trained was one named Nosy, N-O-C, And Nosy developed the ability within, I think they grabbed him from the wild when he was less than 1 year old. And he spent all his life in captivity. And some 6 years into his life in captivity, he suddenly began mimicking human voices, and quite remarkably so. Didn't sound quite intelligible, but when they measured what he was doing, he was speaking exactly in the rhythms and the octaves of human speech, not whale speech. It was totally different. And so this is the first sort of codified example of an animal going way, way out of its way to sound like us. And the point of my piece is it wasn't, mere amusement or for either him or us. It was actually a kind of whale rendition of why the cage bird sings. It was a sort of desperate loneliness, which we now know and can codify thanks to the science. It's the whole backstory of Nosy and what prompted him to the mind and the motive behind the mimicry, as I put it. So that'll be out in Smithsonian in June. A very sad and very telling story because, we hear a lot about orcas through movies like Blackfish, but less has been known and written about the beluga, which is really why I wanted to get my 2 cents in about them and what we're beginning to learn about them. And one of the reasons we don't know as much about them, of course, is they're a very remote species. So that's the next. And then I believe my next book is going to be a book about animal personality, what personality it is in the first place, and how it's intimately bound with the personality of non-humans. So, boy, doesn't that dovetail with everything we're discussing here.
Yep, June issue of the Smithsonian. I think that about covers this, but you shared a lot of great insights and much appreciated.
Oh, you're always very welcome.